Hello and welcome to Thanatoy's Towers. Today I'm going completely mask off and letting that tism rip by redesigning Sonic in my style. AKA, we're going extra edge-tastic whilst barely avoiding slipping over the line into going full-on fedora tipping trenchcoat mode. Now the whole Sonic splicing thing is a risky game here, but I'm sure as long as we don't involve any electric rats in this fusion, we'll be completely What the fuck? Oh! Usually when I kick a 3D project off, be it designing a model for 3D printing or even renders or animation, I usually throw together a little mood board and then mostly completely wing it, and essentially concept the whole thing on the fly. However, for this Speedy Vermin project I wanted to try being a little more prepared. In my mind I wanted Sonic's proportions to be somewhat of a merge between his modern design and his super angular look from that one OVA from the 90s. You know, the one with the cat girls and the creep shots? Yeah. Well, I found some concept art which basically had the exact proportions I was looking for and did a quick paint over. My little gloomer critters usually just have blank eyes, but something about that look just didn't quite sit right with me for Sonic. So I just randomly tried sketching a little speedy spiral in there and I just had to go with it. And hey, if you think that's a total rip-off of the Fleetway Supersonic design, well, you're gonna fucking lose it later, buddy. I also kept his cute little neckerchief from the original concept since I reckon it breaks the colours up quite nicely. With a pretty solid concept in hand, I start blocking Sonic out in ZBrush. I start out with a basic sphere and then start adding more spheres and pushing and pulling on my little vertices to get some spine action going. This is pretty much how I block out everything on the model and how I start all my sculpts in general, although it's very difficult to resist the temptation to dig in and start going crazy hacking away at Sonic's skin with your sculpting tools immediately. You're gonna get way better results if you make sure your model's overall silhouette and sculpt is completely sound from the get-go. Sometimes it's a little tricky getting the proportions down when translating super stylized 2D characters into 3D, because they often have the Mickey Mouse or Goku effect, where even if they turn around, parts of their silhouette remain in place. So in Sonic's case, in a lot of concept art, if he's facing the front, you'll still see his quills sticking out to the side, when they should be perfectly straight. In these cases, you've just got to make a rough compromise, but luckily, or unluckily, depending on the title, we've had enough 3D Sonic games to understand how to visualise the blue little critter. For the shoes, I was originally going to go for a squiggly kind of pattern to match it with the whole wavy spiral motif, but I ended up just going full Guy Fieri mode with a spiky flame-like look instead. I wasn't really totally sold on it at first and figured I'd go back and rework it, but it grew on me. And of course eventually, tragically, sooner or later we have to get to my least favourite part of any character sculpt, the hands. Just like every other little fleshy bit of Sonic, I stretch out a bunch of primitive shapes to get a rough outline of a hand-shaped object and then roughly sculpt some loose form into them. I wanted to keep that spiky edge-tacular look for his chest fur too, rather than Sonic's usual round blob. But I tried to hold myself back from going too excessive with the size and extravagance of the design. I'll be saving those traits for when I get around to working on the coolest guy ever. And last up, we can block out and roughly sculpt in the form of his dumb little neckerchief. Oh my bad, we also need to quickly throw in the rough shape of his little ear hair tuft, which sounds a lot less kawaii when described out loud. Now we can finally get a little less flat and start sculpting. Like with basically every phase of a model, I start off with the head and sculpt in the outline of his eye area. In between the sculpting, I find myself doing a lot of tweaking on the fly when I notice certain shapes not looking quite right in comparison to my reference images. For instance, I somehow completely missed that in my concept Sonic has 4 spines on his back instead of the usual 2. Whoops! Now it's time for the spiral! In the past, when I've worked on sculpts, even for stylized characters, I've always just sculpted things like mouth shapes and eye outlines into the surface of the model. However, I've come to find that by instead creating these shapes as separate block colour sticky outy pieces, it works out far better for a more cartoony style and makes it way easier for us to apply colours in the 3D print slicing process later. With all that endless tweaking done, actually, that's a lie, it's far from over, I assure you, we can get back to my favourite part, the hands! I don't know why, but no matter how many times I try sculpting them, these little flesh nodes always completely elude me. Thankfully, Sonic's big glove digits aren't exactly the most detailed, so he can get away with not getting too detailed. I'll also be posing them in fists for the sculpt, so frankly a lot of this was unnecessary, but I'd also like to try making this design into a 3D asset later, like the little gloomy freak addressing you right now, so it'll come in handy then. Since I felt like I had the final form of the head and spines down, I didn't. I fused those delectable arcs and his bold dome together and smoothed out the parts where they intersect. I also fused in the little fur tuft in front of the ears and did a little tweaking and sculpting of the form. Cue another little tweaking montage. I'm also sculpting in a little more emphasis to the stylized folds of the cuffs on Sonic's gloves and boots. I think exaggerated forms and shapes are important for any kind of stylized character, but they're especially important for FDM printing, which has a bad habit of smoothing out a lot of softer detail, so I tend to go as hardcore as possible. At this stage, to help with visualizing him, I'm adding colour to the hedgehog shaped fella. This really helped to realise basically everything about his face shape was wrong, so more unlimited tweak works were necessary. I also tried shifting his mouth on over to the centre to see if that made the design read better in 3D, but don't get too used to it because we're gluing it back onto his cheek later. Here I realised I had become so deeply entrenched and obsessed with all the spindly spine fondling that I totally forgot about the spiral designs on his gloves. Now with a ton of grouping, masking and prayers, I roughly reshape the hands into fists, then I go in with a move, push, pull and shatter those bones till I get a satisfactory form. Once I'm happy with the shape, I remesh the whole thing and modify the sculpt to make it a whole bunch more stylized and closer to the original concept. Apologies, but I somehow forgot to smash the record button on OBS for the start of the posing stage. But you just missed a little Sonic foot action. I tried to go for a compromise between the pose from the initial concept and all those little critter with an attitude poses you'd see Sonic in from the early 2000s and late 90s. As promised, I also ripped that smile right off his jaw and slammed it back in its rightful place. With his pose down, we're almost ready to get to printing. However, since I always like to give my prints a nice fuzzy texture in part because I really dig the look, but mainly because it masks the layer lines crazy well, we need to create modifier shapes to let 3D Print Slicer know which areas to fuzz up and which to leave smooth. So, to do this I extend the reverse side of all the smooth bits, inflate their scales so they ever so slightly overlap their original shape and export them as a separate object. Then I import both the sculpt and the modifier into my 3D Print Slicer and set them up accordingly. Sonic, I'm breaking away from my usual small, teeny tiny keychain scale proportions and going full respectable 9cm figurine mode. Perfect for planting on your crusty IKEA shelving unit right next to your pristine Funky Pop collection, you soy-filled bitch. I had a feeling that would prove to be very correct, that due to Sonic's top-heavy proportions he might need a little more assistance to stay upright, so I added in a cube modifier to let the slicer know to add extra infill to his shoes to keep him weighted down. You may have also noticed I enabled that fuzzy skin option. Now, I jumped the gun a little, since I should have just waited on the first test print to avoid having to repeat this whole song and dance, but I wanted to get him all coloured up right away. As mentioned earlier, giving Sonic embossed features for his face details means that we can easily just take the fill tool and toss that colour on, rather than having to do it manually. However, no matter what, I always find that the slicer has a weird way of computing the way you paint your objects, and adds in random defects that you have to mangle with and keep re-slicing until you trick it into not completely fucking the shapes up. Now I'm just painting in where I want the supports to be placed on Sonic. Being used to printing smaller scale models, I went a little too light here and ended up bulking up the placement after the first test print. With the supports in place, it's time to fire up that printer for a test print. For this first test, I'm using my Bamboo Labs A1 Mini to churn out the single colour prototype. After peeling them off the build plate, we just need to nip off those supports and slice off a bit of the excess plastic from the raft around his shoes. And this is where I discovered that, yes, I was in fact right to worry about his proportions, because apparently the infill wasn't enough. I went back into ZBrush and reposed him to make the weight distribution a little more realistic, and honestly it turned out to be kinda a blessing in disguise, since I think this new pose is a little more dynamic than the original. Okay, so I'd like to say that the second time was the charm. However, I ended up having a bunch of printer calibration issues just randomly out of nowhere. The supports on that last grey guy there took like 20 minutes to remove. They somehow fused onto him so tightly. However, they at least could stand now, and after getting my printer fixed up, it was time to fire up the full colour print badge. So at this point, whilst my P1P printer was busy printing up the blue blurs, I kinda wished I could maximise time and get a few more printed out using my A1, but unfortunately it can only handle 4 colour prints. Which is when I suddenly had the bright idea to overcomplicate things further and transform the Sculpting into Supersonic. Oh yes, I know he's also technically 5 colours, but fuck it, we're giving my Supersonic wide glowing radiant skin to match his beautiful blonde locks and maximise his Alpha Aryan Chad energy. I gave his spines a lot more flow here to make it look like they're absolutely flowing with that spiral energy. His spines are the spines that will pierce the heaven. Okay, no, that's... I also modify his mouth expression to give him a little more stoic tood, and then leave his eyes as is and totally don't rip off the Fleetway Supersonic's peepers. At this point I tried experimenting with a bunch of spiral type patterning and motifing around his body, even trying to involve his dumb neckerchief and all that nonsense. However, ultimately I just decided to scrap it. I wasn't feeling it, and it made this design way too busy. Anyway, I shipped this super-powered little cretin off to my printer for a test print too, and unlike his puny underpowered form, he came out pretty perfect on the first attempt. So I quickly painted him up in the slicer, went full Project Shadow with cloning that sucker, and mailed him off to Printer City. So, I'd like to tell you that after kicking my feet up for the next few days, the little pricks were all printed up and ready for me to rub my greasy fingers all over. But if that were the case, this video would have been up 3 weeks ago. You see, when it comes to dealing with 3D printers and their many complications, when it rains, it pours. I started having sudden crazy layer shifts and other assorted malfunctions completely out of nowhere on both my printers at once, and have spent literally weeks holding myself back from doing that thing Mark Wahlberg did to that homeless guy that time to them whilst trying to get them in line. However, after replacing a bunch of printer parts and hopefully permanently remedying these issues, I finally have a whole colony of colourful vermin to prep up. Oh, and because I was also terrified of losing yet another 5-day long print, I separated the head and body of Sonic into 2 parts. After popping them off the build plate, my first order of business is to yank off all their little supports. A lot of these are wedged in awkward spots like between Sonic's twiggy little legs, so a pair of nippers come in handy for ripping them out. Supersonic was printed on my A1 Mini, which is dialed in a little better than my P1P, so supports are a little less of a waking nightmare to rip and tear through. After support removal, there's always a bunch of debris left over from the structures, as well as a few potential zits and blobs from a printing process. To get rid of these, I just go crazy on the prints with an X-Acto knife. A few of the Sonic body parts had some issues where a few areas had become contaminated from colour swaps. To remedy this, I used my latest little gizmo acquisition, the Pine-Sil soldering iron, to weld a tiny amount of the correct colour of plastic over the blemishes. It's also very useful for cleaning up little rough overhangs too, just don't make it too hot or you'll get a Sonic soup. Speaking of heat blasts, to get rid of all the white stress marks left from the cleanup and support removal, we need to go full Eggman and fire tactical burn strikes on the hog with our heat gun. Now to make these guys just a little more exciting, and frankly because I do it to all my designs to give them more life, I take some clear UV gloss nail gel and brush it over the eye to give them a glassy finish. For these guys I did between 3 to 5 coats per eye, and at the end of each coat I hit it with a UV torch to cure that layer. Finally, we just need to glue Sonic's body and head together and this cursed project is finally over! Let's take a look at the Blue Blur's new look! Thanks so much for checking out the video, guys. If you'd like your own little speedster, I currently have 2 small batches of Sonic and Super Sonic available from my store right now, so hit up the link in the description to snag one. I have plenty more videos just like this one planned, so to be first in line to see them, please hit that subscribe button, and maybe even drop me a like if you dug peeping the process. Also, drop me a comment if you have any ideas for stuff you'd like to see me work on. Till then, I'll catch you all later. See ya!